We want to talk about the dictatorship of Julius Caesar and his rise to power. We've been talking about his rise to power previously and how he came through the first triumvirate. But once he has defeated Pompey the Great, we'll now see that Julius Caesar will come into sole power in Rome and be consolidating power around himself. In 45 BC, Caesar is named dictator of Rome. Now remember, for the Romans, dictator doesn't have the negative connotations that it does for us. We've sort of picked up on that later on. It's supposed to be a ruler who was temporary and in a time of a crisis or emergency. But he's going to be called or named dictator for 10 years. So during a crisis, having a dictator is allowed, and I guess the idea here, they just had a civil war, so they need a strong ruler. But of course, Julius Caesar is going to try to maneuver this into long-term power for himself. Once he gets into power, he begins to change the rules. He sees to it that he is given permanent imperium, which means the power to rule the military and to gather an army and so forth. This is the real power of Rome, imperium, from which we get our word imperial and empire. He's also labeled as sacrosanct. Sacrosanct. This means that he cannot be touched. In other words, no one can approach him. No one can lay hold of him without his permission, of course. It was kind of a protection and almost the idea of being sacred. The same kind of rule was in place for the Vestal Virgins, who could not be touched. So this gives him an air of sort of holiness or being set apart because no one can touch him. And he takes upon himself the title Pater Patria, or pater meaning father, patria meaning the fatherland. He's father of the fatherland, or father of the land. Again, he will gather other titles to himself. He'll set about reforming things in Rome. He wanted to reduce the number of people on the dole. The dole was a handout of grain, of bread. This had really grown during the time of the Punic Wars, especially when Hannibal was in the land and wreaked a lot of havoc. A lot of farmland was disrupted. Many people moved to Rome, the city of Rome, looking for jobs, looking for food. And this had just kept multiplying. He also wanted to get the calendar in place. There were a lot of problems with the calendar. They were using a lunar calendar, and their estimations of it, of course, if you use a lunar calendar, you go by the moon, right? The moon goes through a cycle every 28 days. And that, if you go through 12 lunar cycles, you come up short for a solar year. So this created a lot of problems, keeping track of things. Even the seasons, they would have to sort of stick days in to even it out. So he wanted to try to get things regimented that way. So he makes the change to a solar calendar, which is, of course, what we use in the West today, a solar calendar. It's even called the Julian calendar because it is the calendar set up by Julius Caesar. There will come a time when a month is named after him. They renamed the month Quintilis to July in 45 BC. This was done to honor Julius Caesar. Of course, he didn't protest. And he took a month in the summer, some of the best weather in Italy, in July. If you take a look at our months, originally the Romans had 10 months, and then they will divide it into 12 months because they like everything in tens. So if you take a look, for example, November is the 9th month, October the 8th month, September the 7th month, December the 10th month. And then you have a month like July. July was Quintilis, okay, Quin, like 5, 5th month. And then, of course, the next month was later named for Augustus Caesar and called August. Some of the other months then have names like January is named for the Roman god Janus, who is a two-faced god, one face looking towards the back and one looking towards the front, and this is the beginning of the new year. A month like March is named for the god of war, Mars, because March was a good month in Italy to go to war. Winter's over, summer hasn't started, but you can get a good start on your military campaigns before you'd have to worry about winter. A lot of wars began around that time of the year. April from apire, which means to open. It's the flowers opening, the buds opening up, that sort of thing. June, named for the goddess Juno. Juno was, as we mentioned earlier, was associated with women and issues or problems maybe women have in particular. So this is why, for example, here in the United States, June is the month to get married. It goes all the way back to the Romans, because in Rome, June was the month to get married. And it's because it's affiliated with Juno, and Juno was the month of the woman, the goddess for women in particular, and especially over marriage and childbearing and all that kind of stuff. So you may not know why June's the best month for marriage, it just is, but you can take it all the way back to the Romans. Now the other thing that Julius Caesar is going to do is begin to colonize and really try to incorporate the land. As recently a lot of land has come to the Romans, especially in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, and up in what today would be France. So here you see a map that shows the areas, all the way here at Spain. Here's Gaul, which is France, and Julius Caesar had conquered Gaul. He writes about it in his Gallic Wars. And you can see this yellow sort of color is all the territory added up to his death, including Egypt and Syria and lots of North Africa and Gaul and Transalpine Gaul and so forth. So you see extensive territory now up to the time of 44 BC. This is a large area which the Romans now are going to try to control. Now, of course, Julius Caesar is famous for his rise to power, but then his abrupt downfall. It will happen on March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March. Julius Caesar is on his way to a meeting of the Senate, and there were many senators, including the one pictured here, Brutus, who believed that Julius Caesar was becoming a king. It's one thing that the Romans did not like was a king. There's lots of titles even the later emperors will take, numerous ones. But one title they will never take is Rex, R-E-X, Rex, which means king. And this is really what they accused Julius Caesar of, becoming a king. And this was not a good thing in their opinion. And so many of the senators got together in a conspiracy, and they plotted to execute, to kill, to murder Julius Caesar. And so there were others in the plot as well, but these senators sort of headed it up, including Cassius, Gaius Cassius, and Marcus Brutus, and Decimus Brutus. These three, the Bruti brothers, the Brutus, the two Bruti would be plural for Brutuses, and Cassius. So Brutus and Cassius, they will be the ones that will lead this. And in fact, this was interesting because, you know, Brutus was a very close friend of Julius Caesar, but they finally came to this opinion that this was the only way. So as he's ready to enter the Senate, they stabbed him multiple times, and that will be the end of Julius Caesar. Now, not the end of the problem, because many people, many of the Roman people loved Julius Caesar, despite his, you know, tendency to want to run everything, because he had brought a lot of good change for them. And so there develops then two factions. One is sort of appalled by the fact that Julius Caesar was assassinated in this way, and then others who feel that it was the only way to save the Roman Republic. So this will then bring about these two groups. The Caesarians, those would be those who are in favor of Julius Caesar, that is, opposed to his execution, and they want to punish those who did it, including a very close friend of Julius Caesar and a general who had served under him, Mark Antony, and Octavius. Octavius was in fact a relative of Julius Caesar, a nephew. He was unknown in Rome. This is part of the problem. He was not from Rome at all. He was very young, but he was named in Julius Caesar's will as his successor, which was a great surprise to everyone, because Julius Caesar had a young son with Cleopatra. Cleopatra was hated in Rome, and she had fled. She had left Rome before this happened. So really there was no heir to the throne when Octavius is named, and he's unknown. This made many people, I'd say more than curious, incredulous that this was happening. Anyway, these two team up along with Lepidus to try to revenge Julius Caesar's death. So this was sometimes called the Second Triumvirate. We talked about the First Triumvirate earlier. The Second Triumvirate, as opposed to the first one, is legal. It's open. Everybody knew about it. These three men came together and said, we are going to team up to go after those who executed Julius Caesar and to try to bring an end to them and to try to restore things as best we can back to the way Julius Caesar would have wanted them to be. So obviously this is going to lead to a civil war between these Caesarians, the Second Triumvirate, and their men, along with the Republicans, including Brutus and Cassius and others. And so we'll see that eventually they will meet at a key battle. This key battle will be in 42 BC at Philippi. Philippi is in Macedonia. It's north of Athens, and of course, if you're familiar with the book of Philippians in the Bible, it's the same city of the Philippians, Philippi. It's a battle just north of the city there in 42 BC. Octavian turns out is sick during the time of this battle. That leaves most of the things up to Mark Antony. At any rate, Brutus and Cassius are defeated, and rather than being taken captive, they fell on their swords. They committed a kind of ritual suicide rather than be humiliated back in Rome, which they didn't want to go through. So they commit this suicide, and that is basically the end of this phase, anyway, of the Civil War. Many people thought, well, maybe it's now all over. The First Triumvirate has it. But the problem then, of course, as always, when you have three ambitious and powerful people, well, they still remain ambitious and seeking power. So the triumvirate then begins to divide up the land. Lepidus gets North Africa. Antony takes the east, including Syria and Egypt and so forth, while Octavian is in the west. So this would be Spain. He's in Italy, but he controls Spain and Italy and Greece, I guess, parts of Greece, but mostly Spain, Italy, and Gaul. And so this relationship then is somewhat balanced, although I think tense, especially between Antony and Octavian. And then Lepidus dies. And this upsets this sort of balance they had created. And now we have just two, Antony, Octavian. Antony and Octavian had actually sort of sealed their alliance through marriage. Octavian's sister, Octavia, marries Mark Antony. And that is meant to try to tie them together even more. However, even though Mark Antony is married to Octavia, when he goes to the east, he meets the same Cleopatra that Julius Caesar. I mean, he had met her before, but Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, of course, as we mentioned before, had a relationship and had a child eventually. And now, with Julius Caesar dead, Mark Antony in the east, he begins to team up with Cleopatra. In fact, she comes looking for him. She sails to what would be Turkey today, close to Syria, and she comes to Antioch, and she sails up the Orontes River with him, and by the time they make it back, the alliance is formed. So Mark Antony and Cleopatra team up, and they say, you know, we're friends. We were friends of Julius Caesar. I have Julius Caesar's son, Cleopatra says, and he could be the next emperor or next ruler of Rome. He's too young now, so let's team up together. We will run Rome, and then when, you know, little Caesarion gets old enough, he will take over. So, of course, the problem is Mark Antony's already married, and now he has Cleopatra. And Octavia is the sister, of course, of Octavian. So we see that this adds to the tension between them. Antony declares Caesar and Cleopatra's son the rightful heir to the throne of or rule in Rome. And therefore it's not Octavian who was mentioned in the will, and they say, well, the will was wrong because it superseded by the fact that Julius Caesar had a son. So anyway, this creates more tension, and eventually a showdown between Octavian and Mark Antony, which will culminate in a major sea battle. Cleopatra and Antony take their ships, their fleets. They were taking them to Italy, but Octavian meets them in Greece, near Greece, in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. This turns out to be a decisive battle that Octavian wins. And as it's seen, you know, as they see that they're going to lose, first Cleopatra flees, heading back to Egypt, try to be safe there, and then shortly thereafter, Mark Antony will follow and headed the same way. When they get back to Egypt separately, Mark Antony will search for Cleopatra, and she commits suicide by a bite of a poisonous asp, A-S-P, asp, a poisonous snake, a viper, bites her up in the neck area. And when Mark Antony finds that Cleopatra is committed suicide, and he falls on his sword, and much like Brutus and Cassius did earlier, because he did not want to be humiliated. And that ends this round of fighting between Octavian and Antony. So this makes Octavian then the sole ruler of Rome. He is the adopted heir to Julius Caesar, but his relative. He's still very young and relatively unknown, but of course he's proved himself because he's come out on top not only defeating the Republicans, but he's defeated now the other main member of the triumvirate. Here is a map showing that Battle of Actium, 2nd of September 31 BC. You can see in green Octavian's fleet and in blue Antony's. And you can see Antony took off, and so too will Cleopatra. So by the way, this Octavian, as we will see later, will change his name. He will take the name of his uncle, Caesar, and he will take the title of Augustus. So he'll be Caesar Augustus, which I'm sure you've heard of. Well, we'll end it there, and we'll pick up the Roman Empire with the next chapter.